Good afternoon, everybody. Is this too loud? If it ends up being too loud, you can scroll down, Jim, and turn the volume down a little bit. If people think it's too uproarious. How about this? See, it doesn't want to play nice. It's like, it's all one. Okay. Oh, okay, great. Perfect, we got it. So good afternoon again. I am Dana Schoaf, Director of Interpretation here at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Look at this standing room only crowd. We should have charged double to get in, I guess. I don't know. I hope no one told you any falsehoods like we're handing out ice cream or something. But regardless, you're here and you're going to hear a really interesting talk. If you aren't members and you want to consider membership, please take a copy of our member magazine, The Surgeon's Call. There's some on that back table when you leave. We've just redesigned it and it's really interesting, full of cool information. It comes out twice a year, and there's other benefits of membership as well. So do consider that. Again, thank you for coming in here. It's certainly warm out there, so you know, it's a little break from the heat in here anyway. So I wanted to introduce a speaker, and it's always nice for me when the speaker is actually a friend of mine, and Jim Broomall, I guess I gotta call him Dr. Broomall, during the introduction, and I've been friends for a while. I don't think Jim's ashamed. We met through Living History when we still were active in that, reenacting, and we enjoyed each other's company. And since then, we've gone on to give battlefield tours together, and we're going to be doing another one of those soon. So it's always nice to have someone you're familiar with come in and give a talk here. And Jim has developed quite a reputation over the last few years. He is currently the William Binford Vest Chair, that's a mouthful, in history at the University of Richmond. And prior to that, he was the director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War at Shepherd University. So he's just recently moved down to Richmond. He is a cultural historian of the Civil War era and has published articles or essays in Commonplace, Ohio Valley History, Gettysburg Magazine, Civil War History, and Civil War Times, which I used to edit. He co-edited Rethinking American Emancipation, Legacies of Slavery and the Quest for Black Freedom, Cambridge University Press 2016, and in 2019, the University of North Carolina Press published his book, Private Confederacies, The Emotional Worlds of Southern Men as Citizens and Soldiers. Dr. Broomall has completed 3 major historic resource studies for the National Park Service. He is currently working on a book project called Battle Pieces, The Art and Artifacts of the American Civil War Era, which explores how historical imagery and military artifacts were used to create representations of violence, war, and death. His wife, Tish, who is here today, and their 3 children, Simon, Henry, and Addie, who is also here today, live in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And Jim's talk, Reimagining the Reality of War, a consideration of pictures of the dead in Antietam, I'm sure will be fascinating. Jim and I share a love of poring over photos, so I can't wait to hear what he's come out in his conclusions. Come on up, Jim.
Right, good afternoon. How is everyone?
Good.
Hot? Yeah, so 2 hours ago I was stuck on the Bay Bridge. And it was very dicey as to whether or not I'd be here. So Dana was getting ready to develop his own program when I texted him and said, this isn't looking good. And my daughter Addie was stuck with me in the car ride. The boys wisely stayed at the beach, and I'll be joining them tomorrow. I'm very grateful to be here. The National Museum of Civil War Medicine has been a longtime partner, and I'm friends with many of the staff here, the director, David Price, of course, Dana, Melissa Lynn, and so I'm very grateful for the invitation and for the talk today. When Dana reached out, I didn't have really a firm idea as to what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to use this as an opportunity to explore some concepts that I'm developing in my current book project. I have long been sort of captivated by the images of the Antietam dead, and I increasingly sort of saw an opportunity perhaps to question some orthodoxy about these images and to sort of open up the broader cultural context around this famed series of photographs. Before I begin, I do want to offer a disclaimer. There are, as the talk title suggests, numerous images of the dead in today's talk, and there will be several post-mortem images as well. So I just want to sort of warn my audience about that, both virtual and in person. Okay? Okay. So I guess I want to start and make sure everyone actually knows this quote. Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war. If he has not brought home bodies and laid them on our doorsteps, in our dooryards and along our streets, he has done something very like it. Now, in my audience, is this a familiar quote? There's some nods, some no's.
Yep.
Okay. So this is an anonymous review that appears in the New York Times on the 20th of October, 1862. And it's in reference to, as I'll talk about today, an exhibition that Matthew Brady, the famed Civil War photographer, offered at his gallery at 10th and Broadway. So we're going to get into sort of the details of that. But the whole sort of talk hinges on the significance of this particular quote. And just sort of briefly to go through this, it really has been used to illustrate over the past several decades Americans' supposedly stunned reactions to the photographs of the Antietam dead. William Frazanino, the famed historian of Civil War photography, was probably the first historian to unearth this particular quote and to then use it in his magisterial work, Antietam, the Photographic Legacy of America's Bloodiest Day. He called this piece of writing one of the most pensive commentaries ever written concerning a series of war photographs. Ken Burns. How many of you have heard of Ken Burns? Yeah, we got resonates, right? He's coming up on the big 250 of his series on the American Revolution. Well, in 1990, Ken Burns dedicates a huge portion of his episode on 1862 and the Battle of Antietam to this review. He sort of does a series of these still frame images of the Antietam dead, and then a voiceover reads this review at length. Finally, an esteemed scholar of American visual culture described Brady's exhibit as, quote, striking like a thunderbolt. So that's the prevailing view. And in many ways, I can see why. This is a beautifully written, powerfully phrased piece of journalism. The prose is evocative, and the message is clear. Yet, what I really want to ask us today, has the review taken on a life of its own? Have we sort of lost the broader cultural context for these images? And did these particular photographs truly bring home the reality of war? So we're going to go on a journey, and we're going to use different types of evidence. I'll have you engage some of the material as we talk today, and I want to sort of build a case, essentially, a bit of detective work here, as to what we do and do not know about 19th century Americans' reactions to the Antietam dead. What other visual culture surrounds these particular images? So beyond photographs, we have lithographs, for instance, and stereo views, and other means of portable technologies. Now, it's important to note, since my audience, I think, is mixed in terms of knowledge base, Matthew Brady did not go to the Antietam battlefield to take these photographs. Now, he's not a con artist. This is very typical. In the 19th century, a photographer like Matthew Brady, who's extraordinarily popular, essentially is sort of the money, the force behind his artists. And these photographers often refer to themselves as artists because they saw themselves as an extension of painters during the era of Romanticism. So two of his artists, James Gibson and Alexander Gardner, arrive either on the day of the battle itself, September 17th, 1862, or shortly thereafter on the 18th or the 19th. This is remarkable. On the day of the battle, one sketch artist surveying the field said that, quote, the hills were black with spectators. It's been estimated about 5,000 people viewed the Battle of Antietam as it was being fought in the forests and fields beyond Sharpsburg, Maryland, about 25 miles from here. Is that about right, Dana? 30 miles? So this should automatically cause some pause. 19th century Americans are actively going to these battlefields to watch this fight unfold. Now, the photographers started on the north end of the field and made their way south. As they were going about their work, there were active burial details interring the dead. Several thousand Union and Confederate dead. And remember, those individuals would remain on that Antietam battlefield in two capacities. The first capacity, United States soldiers remained on the field until 1866, and then they were reinterred at the National Cemetery in 1867, and Confederate dead largely remained on the field until 1871, 72, where they are reinterred in a number of different towns in Western Maryland and West Virginia. Now, in some instances, Gardner and Gibson begin to capture the burial details going about their work. In other cases, they take images of the dead who have yet to be interred. And somewhere between about late September and early August, they take some 95 images of the Antietam battlefield. It's a remarkable moment of photojournalism. When Brady begins to plan his exhibit, which he does quite early, back to that slide there, he wants to take a portion of these images, several dozen, maybe as many as 45, and put them on display in the gallery that you see before you, again at 10th and Broadway in New York City. Now, quite remarkably, again, Brady is entrepreneurial, Brady's extraordinarily clever, he's good at his job. So Brady starts these small advertisements in the New York Times beginning on the 3rd of October. So this is just 2 weeks after the battle. And the first one appears saying, quote, Mr. N.B. Brady has just received from his artists who are at the Battle of Antietam a most interesting series of views. The article promised, quote, pictures of the field of battle, the positions of the several corps, and many thrilling incidents. And here's a key extension. The public can see and purchase copies of Brady's gallery. Okay? It's vague, right? This first review is relatively vague, but it's starting to pique, hopefully, people's interests. And that's indeed what it does. Several days later, on the 6th of October, another piece comes out. And it says that if our readers wish to know the horrors of the battlefield, let them go to Brady's studio and see fearful reproductions which he has on exhibition and for sale. Audiences will greet all the literal repulsiveness of nature and see the corpses of our dead soldiers side by side in the quiet impassiveness of rest. Blackened faces, distorted features, expressions most agonizing. And the idea is that they will, quote, teach us a lesson which it is well for us to learn. So now, several days later, starting to crystallize his purposes here. He's promising the public audiences are going to be seeing images of the battlefield dead in all different forms and sights, distorted bodies, contorted faces, and significantly, that these consuming audiences can purchase these images at the gallery. And the lead-up works extraordinarily well. We know that People came by the hundreds, perhaps the thousands, to see the exhibition of the Antietam dead. And unlike most sort of, again, estimates, the exhibit probably opened only 2.5 weeks after the battle. So Brady's really trying to do two things here. First, he's engaging in a form of photojournalism. He is bringing to American audiences, for the first time, images of a Civil War battlefield and the dead therein. Second, as an entrepreneur, he wants to sell images of these dead. He is, in essence, marketing the dead as a commodity. And so those are sort of his two goals. And again, according to the accounts, there were crowds of people. And it's sort of, the language is interesting. Because again, if we go back to the beginning of this talk, I said most people claim in the popular discourse that audiences are repulsed by these images. And here's what the New York Times Review goes on to say. You will find the audiences, quote, bending over the photographic views of that fearful battlefield. One would think that it should bear away the palm of repulsiveness, but on the contrary, there is, quote, a terrible fascination about that draws one near these pictures and makes him loath to leave them. So audiences are sort of being compelled by these images. And we have an audience member who has been kind enough to, after the talk, will show us a stereo view and a stereo viewer. But one of the key ways in which audiences are consuming these images is in a three-dimensional plane. So in other words, through this device, the picture that you just saw here, the double negative, is placed on cardboard, and the stereo viewer in turn, once placed up to the eyes, does an optical illusion where it pops almost in a three-dimensional plane. And this becomes an extraordinarily popular form for audiences to sort of entertain themselves on any given evening in the era before Netflix and TikTok. And so these stereo viewers really begin to transport people in a way that makes possible these portable and private panoramas. It really facilitates this decisive moment in American middle-class life where the viewer is able to sort of transform his or her living room into this microcosm of the perceptible world around them, as the historian of photography Alan Trachtenberg notes. And so again, in sort of trying to get us in the context of these images, many audiences are, bent over these tables, carefully viewing these images, in some cases using stereo viewers to bring them up to their eye level to see them again on this three-dimensional plane. It suggests, again, as the review says, they have a terrible fascination with these pictures. And in many ways, that's exactly the point of this new technology. It's meant to transport people to places that they wouldn't otherwise have access to, or places they couldn't otherwise be. So while the images of Antietam perhaps are the most famous, the ones that are the most common are going to be striking views of waterfalls in upstate New York, pastoral views of the far west, and again, just a very popular form of entertainment. Now, Americans' desire to interact with these Antietam photographs connects to another thread that I mentioned, which is that people are going to the battlefield itself, both on the day of the fight and then the subsequent days and weeks and months that follow. This is Edwin Forbes's rendition of what he calls, quote, a private box, a family behind a fence rail, seeing off in the distance the smoke of the battle. And indeed, Edwin Forbes claims that Antietam probably had more witnesses than any battle of the American Civil War. Now, why would audiences, just I'm going to throw this out here, why would audiences go to a Civil War battlefield? What are they seeking? What are they trying to do? Any thoughts?
There's feeling like you're a part of history?
Okay, this is a pivotal event, and for people who may be from a rural area, who want to be connected to something broader, certainly. What else?
There's loved ones.
And there are many who are going to be seeking out the wounded, certainly, and to succor those wounded and to provide care. What else?
Excitement.
Excitement, which is going to merge into the area of what I want to call sort of voyeurism, right? And so, I think many probably had legitimate motives for going to these fields, but again, it creates a lot of tension because the soldiers, especially after the fight is over, are quite disturbed to see, quote, the country people flocking to the battlefield like, for that term, vultures, like vultures. And so again, it's sort of suggestive of how 19th century audiences may have been interacting with the dead in ways that I think we ourselves would find anachronistic or off-putting or even odd. And many of these individuals, this is one thing that wasn't cited, are looking for souvenirs. So they're certainly searching for kin, they're certainly caught up in the excitement, they're certainly interested, but they're also literally picking from the battlefield. Cannonballs, guns, bayonets, swords, canteens, all this detritus of war they're actively collecting. And again, I want to suggest they are actively being censured for these activities. And so separate from the Antietam dead, probably the second sort of most important image grouping from the Battle of Antietam are two engravings that appear in Frank Leslie's Illustrated Weekly on October 18th, 1862. So just take a minute, and maybe some of you have been to the Antietam battlefield. Does anyone know where this image is on the right-hand side? Sunken Road. And what's sort of the epicenter? What's going on?
Like buried
Yeah, this is probably the 130th PA and several other United States soldiers, regiments that are creating these mass graves, these huge burial pits that are going to inter all the Confederate dead from the Rohrbach Lane and from the Sunken Road. But if you look to your right-hand side here and here, what do we see?
kids.
Children, women, men, spectators. One soldier called them a cadaverous feast. The country people who flocked to the battlefield like vultures, as I quoted earlier, on the one hand, seem to be horrified by this scene. They're certainly repulsed by the smell, but yet they're also seemingly sort of compelled by what they're seeing. And in both of these images, the idea of the vulture is echoed through literal vultures featured in the back, and then the idea that the country people themselves are vultures. This particular view also portrays the enormity of the Battle of Antietam. If you look back, this line goes back into the far distance, hanging out towards Elk Ridge, but it's seemingly limitless, right? It really transmits a sense of scale in ways that maybe the Civil War photographs couldn't quite do. And I would argue, to modern eyes, it beggars belief. But yet, by the late summer of 1862, citizens are a regular feature on Civil War battlefields. We often go to the Battle of Bull Run and talk about the famous instance of the politicians and the genteel folk being caught up in the Federal rout on July 21st, 1861, and say that thereafter this was an anomaly, never to happen again. And yet, here we are one summer later, outside of Sharpsburg, and the audiences are still there in an entirely different capacity. And if I move forward one summer to 1863, we see similar scenes playing out during the Battle of Gettysburg. So this should yet again cause us to sort of question the ways in which audiences are interacting with the fallen. And I would just want to sort of stress for a moment the amount of sort of artifacts, relics, debris, detritus, whatever you want to call it, this collected begins to underpin in the post-Civil War era these quite ornate displays from all this stuff that they found on the field. Sort of memory captured in art, as the Antietam National Battlefield says in their caption. This becomes sort of a genre of collecting in the 1880s and 1890s. Today, a lot of these from early museums in the 1890s and 19 and 20s are now at repositories like the Gettysburg and Antietam National Park Service. Okay, I'll skip ahead here a bit. Stay mindful of time and stay mindful of elements. Okay, so were audiences truly shocked? So when I first started getting interested in this topic, there's sort of a disconnect here. So I have one foot in academic history. I'm a professor at a institution of higher learning, and I have another foot in the public history world. I go out to a lot of different historic sites and engage with different audiences. Historians are pretty settled in their opinion on this matter. Historians like Mark Shantz have said essentially the Antietam photographs would have been viewed as an extension of post-mortem photography. Franny Nullman essentially says that viewers were not likely to be shocked. So scholars are pretty certain in their interpretation of these images. Popular audiences, popular historians, again, a little less so. But scholars like Shantz and Nuttleman, and this is one of the post-mortem images are still more new, are likely to sort of put the Antietam photographs within the context of post-mortem images like these, which are from the Clement Library at the University of Michigan. And I mentioned earlier the three-dimensionality. We have a very similar device that's embedded in this photograph of a young child, and then quite typically, a mourning mother captured with her daughter, who's deceased. To us, this is tough. I mean, I'm a parent of 3 children, and I have a tough time with postmortem photography. To 19th century audiences, this is the last means of remembrance for middle and upper class Americans who could afford these photographs. You know, today we have so many ways to sort of remember family members very portably, very cheaply. But in the 19th century, this is the one means of technology beyond the literal artifact. Hair clippings, for instance, that are turned into wreaths and into jewelry. And so, again, scholars, I'm not fully convinced by this, we're going to work on this together. Scholars, though, often point to post-mortem photography as sort of an extension of the Antietam dead. Now, let me pause here. You've seen a couple of the images so far. You've seen some lithographs. You've seen a stereo view of the Antietam dead. How's the context between these images and the ones I showed you different? Yeah.
The people in the photos know the deceased.
The identity is known. Good. What else?
Quantity.
I'm sorry?
Quantity.
Quantity. And these are very intimate images.
Just to say they're beatific thrones, the continuation of the beautiful death.
The beautiful death, this concept of the good death, the baby appears sleeping, the baby appears sleeping. That's a motif, actually, that the photographers will engage in and will talk about. The context is different. So again, you know, these 2 scholars I quoted are phenomenal scholars. They do incredible work, and I buy much of their argumentation, and they themselves admit the context is entirely different. But I think what they're trying to do is transport us into a space in which we can begin to decipher how 19th century Americans may have viewed these images. And by so doing, they're offering a useful lesson, because this motif or these ideas will be featured in this full-page spread on October the 18th, 1862 in Harper's Weekly. So remember, in this era, photographs can't be reprinted in newspapers. The technology doesn't exist. So instead what happens is a lithograph or an engraving or a woodcut is the closest means of capturing the image. It's a little blurry, that topic, I apologize. It's clear up here. It's not clear up here, I apologize. But if you look at this grouping, these are all images taken by Gardner and Gibson that have been transformed into engravings that Americans will open up hundreds of thousands. I want to stress that. Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's had hundreds of thousands of readers and viewers. Okay? Now, what's also useful is that we have text associated with this particular full spread. And the text, I think, is very telling. And what it tells us is a couple things. The article first features this image here. Does anyone know where that is? Burnside's Bridge, right? This spot is just as lovely and tranquil as when we last visited it. Artistically speaking, the picture is one of the most beautiful and perfect photographed landscapes that we have ever seen. Okay? This idea of sort of pastoral and beautiful. The article then pivots to this image in the upper left-hand side. Where's that one? Hagerstown Turnpike. And it says, this one tells a tale of desperate contention. Traversing it is seen a high fence rail in the foreground, of which are a number of dead bodies grouped in every imaginable position. The stiffened limbs preserving the same attitude as they maintained when they suffered in their last agonies. As with Brady, the article suggests, bring a magnifying glass up to the images so you can see them in clearer relief. The bigger takeaway here, and I think where the two historians I quoted us earlier are trying to go, is that the article begins to pair the beautiful and romantic with the horror and terror of war. It's juxtaposing two different ideas and realities. Does that make sense? Okay, this is one of my big arguments in my upcoming book, so you have to hold tight here with me. So, this is an era in which we're still in the midst of the Victorian sort of sense of romanticism. This is an era in which painters create these vast images of civilizations, of waterfalls, of pastoral landscapes. But this is also an era in which Americans are engaged in a conflict in which 750,000 of them will ultimately die, over 2% of the population. So how do they reconcile the era of romanticism with the terror of war? And sort of my point here is that they have trouble doing so. This is a transformative moment in which there's a lot of tensions between what people are feeling and what they're trying to express. And these tensions actually play out in some of these Antietam photographs that maybe don't get quite as much publicity as the Hagerstown Turnpike or Burnside's Bridge. But this one in particular, I think, is extraordinarily poignant and speaks volumes to what I'm talking about. And so if you're familiar with the Antietam battlefield, and if you haven't been, please go. This is taken about maybe 300 yards north of Dunker Church, about 100 yards east of the Hagerstown Turnpike. And the National Park Service today has a plaque actually marking the spot of this image. And the image is titled, A Contrast, Federal Buried, Confederate Unburied, Where They Fell on the battlefield of Antietam. Gardner takes the image, is then reproduced in Harper's Weekly on the 18th of October, 1862. So again, you're becoming visual historians yourselves. You have more and more context clues. Read this image for me. Tell me what's going on and how it speaks to some of the other images we've seen so far and how it departs. My students are weary. Come on. Yeah.
It's just one dead soldier and one spectator.
Okay.
Not groups.
So there's a conversation, if you will, between the living and the dead, right? Very similar to the post-mortem image. It also has a certain intimacy to it that's similar to a post-mortem image. It's also a commentary. In the article, which I don't think is true, it claims this to be a drummer boy who appears sleeping. It's violent. It's a violent death, certainly, but he appears sleeping. And then this Union officer, who's identified by the headboard carving, which you can read, has been buried as the victors of the field rightfully should be done, and sort of a commentary on the vanquished. But more importantly, it's in conversation with the themes of those post-mortem images that we looked at. There's a certain familiarity, there's a certain intimacy, there's a meditation between the living and the dead. And so one of my points is that Gibson and Gardner and Brady are trying to work within representational forms that audiences would have been familiar with. So they're not trying to just sort of show these unvarnished, horrifying views of the dead. They're also trying to pick up on themes that would cause, I think, pause and contemplation and less shock value for 19th century audiences. And we actually see this idea or motif repeatedly. This is another one of the most famous images taken from the battlefield. It is most likely the horse of a Louisiana colonel, and there are many people who passed the horse on the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th who comment on it. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the father of the Supreme Court Justice, the Corps Commander, Adolphus Williams, and they all notice how serene the horse appears, as though the horse is sleeping. The horse, of course, had been killed during the battle. And then the back view from Brady's album. And then yet again, another series of these images in which the living are, to some extent, in conversation with the dead. With that said, this is still, I think, the more jarring images that would have caused audiences to pause, to look, and to think, and I would argue the grimness is somewhat mediated in the engraved form. They lessen a bit of the violence and the graphic nature of these images when they appear in Harper's or Frank Leslie's. Okay. Now, let me start bringing this home. So, beyond this famed view of the New York Times, what other evidence do we have that 19th century Americans are shocked and horrified by the dead of Antietam photographs? This is remarkable. We really only have one other good source, and that's Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr. was a poet, was a scholar, and he was obsessed with photography. And in the Atlantic Monthly, he writes an extended piece called Doings of the Sunbeam. And in that particular piece, he has a several paragraph section where he talks about the Antietam dead. Now, Holmes himself had been to the battlefield. He was searching for his wounded son. And I would argue he has a pretty idiosyncratic view of the battlefield that's probably very much tainted or shaded by his own terrible experience of trying to find his son, who he thought had been mortally wounded in the West Woods. And what's, again, so sort of interesting about Holmes's description is that he claims once people saw the images of the dead, they would lock them away in a secret drawer, never to view them again. But yet, what have I just told you? They actively bought images of the dead. They actively viewed images of the dead with magnifying glasses. They actively went to Brady's gallery by the hundreds, if not the thousands. And so Holmes's view is pretty, I think, odd, and we once again need to take it with a grain of salt. Beyond that, we begin hitting dead ends. There's simply not much more that we know as to how 19th century audiences were reacting to these images of the Antietam dead. What we do know is this, and this will sort of bring it all home for us. wartime photographs began to transform American visual culture. 18th and 19th century conflicts prior to the invention of the camera had been recorded by sketch and by painting. These were narrative paintings done in the grand tradition, with lots of sort of symbolic representation, and they themselves sort of communicated elements of the good death, narratives about the battle. They told stories. Photographs can be manipulated. Bodies can be moved. Frames can be created to convey ideas, but nonetheless, the Antietam photographs do start to convey a new realism for 19th century Americans, a photojournalism that causes many to feel as though paintings are no longer representing the conflict in ways that do war justice. But they're working within the realm of familiar cultural tropes, as I just said. They're referencing post-mortem photography. They're thinking about the relationship between the living and the dead. They oftentimes capture images of the dead as if they appear sleeping. So it's this transitional moment during a period that is also transformative. Also, finally, it's clear the Civil War Americans were both repulsed and compelled by images of the battlefield dead. It's not an either or, it's both. It's very clear that some people are probably horrified by these images, and it's also very clear that others were not at all surprised and wanted to see more. And I think in many ways, these overall tensions are captured in a painting that appears at the Antietam Visitor Center, though not currently, by a soldier who was at the battle, James Hope, who was in the Vermont Brigade. And if you look at this image for a minute, you get the sense of the pastoral, right? He himself was from the Hudson River Valley School, sort of immersed in this era of Romanticism. But, of course, in the foreground is the horrors of the sunken road. There's this dualism, right? These two things are in tension. And Hope, I think, through painting, communicates those tensions incredibly well. I think we should probably, yeah?
It's going on a quarter of.
Okay. Let's go ahead and wrap it up here. So, in conclusion, well, here, I'll stop on the slide. I'll say in conclusion. I think rather than repulsion, Victorian Americans were most likely to view the battlefield through the lens of actually regeneration. And this is a pretty key motif as well. When citizens began to reconstruct their lives, when soldiers had sort of ended the campaign, they often noted how nature itself began to heal. The land had survived the battle. One journalist traveling to Antietam in 1863 contended, "It is peaceful here today. A stranger would hardly discover that so terrible a conflict had been waged within a year. Time, although a waster, is also a repairer. If he wounds, he also heals." Even the New York Times review that I started this talk with concludes on a hopeful note. And I'll stop with this. "Have heart, poor mother, grieve not without hope, mourn not without consolation. This is not the last of your boy, and then is reserved for him that crown which only heroes and martyrs are permitted to wear, a crown brighter than bays, greener and more healing than laurel. For 19th century Americans, death was both redemptive and regenerative. When we reimagine the famed New York Times review, I think we move closer to the tensions that underpinned how Civil War Americans understood the most transformative moment in their lives and possibly the nation's history." So I'll end on that. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Yes.
For Dr. Broomall?
So I have one question and one comment.
Okay.
The question is, were any of these pictures displayed contemporaneously in the Richmond newspapers? And if so, what was the reaction?
No. So again, this is a very cosmopolitan a limited cosmopolitan audience in New York City. Now that said, we do know that Southern politicians and Southern leadership were actively reading Northern newspapers, especially for military information. So they very well could have gotten copies of Frank Leslie's or Harper's Weekly and seen the engravings of the Antietam dead. But I personally don't know of any commentary that they offered. That's not to say it's not out there, but again, the commentary that we have is extraordinarily limited. So we don't really have a sense. And as an aside, I would note that it was very common for Robert E. Lee's officers to underreport the number of killed and wounded oftentimes in these actions. This kind of is an aside. But to your question, no. We don't have like the Richmond Examiner, for instance, running a similar series. And this is very much a Northern phenomenon. There are lots of Southern photographers. As the materials to process images become more scarce, we see fewer photographers working in the South, but we see lots of Northern photographers going south and taking the images.
Yeah, my comment is that I think there's at least one exception to your idea about pictures, photographs replacing paintings, and that is that the most lasting image of the Spanish Civil War is Picasso's Guernica painting, not a photograph.
Yes.
So, you know, for your book, you might want to contrast how the Spanish Civil War photographs and images had their impact at contemporaneous.
Well, and I think just quickly on that note, you know, World War I sort of transforms the nature of painting, where we have the deconstruction of representational form. And so painting catches up to photographs because Guernica is a horrific portrayal of war in a way that's even more compelling probably than photographs. So our 19th century painters, I think, are still looking back to the 18th century, whereas our early 20th century painters are looking forward to modernism. So, you know, point's well taken. And so in that next transformative moment to modernity, I agree entirely. Yeah. Yes.
Go with you, ma'am, and then we'll get you, sir.
Yeah, hi, how are you?
I'm good.
Good. I'm, as an audience participant, intrigued by how you presented this. The question of what is accuracy and evidence, and what's the standard of evidence that we're always going to use in anything we want to do. So we know largely at the Brady's gallery, they were not photographing deceased human offenders. They were generally staging, perhaps not all staging, but they were largely burn-outs. Okay. Then you have an interesting transition in my view where you have the one etch of, call this the solitude of the spectator looking at the very Union soldier, okay, and the one that's deceased, perhaps sleeping. So there's this, here we have actually the reality of, yes, there is a dead Union member next to a dead Buckeye. Then you go to this incredible painting, go to the painting. And the next painting, that painting again. Yeah. So here my eyes are like totally drawn to the bottom left-hand corner of this. And there you really see the Union's dead in this picture. And it isn't just butternut, which was always coming out at the beginning of the war. So I don't know when this was painted. But for me, it's an interesting transformation of memorialization of what's happened, where it was just the butternut. Then you have that one transitional piece, and then here, this is a full integration of what I would expect the battlefield to have looked like. You see Union dead and you see butternut. Okay. And then, but the pastoral part, I would put aside from my view, because my eyes were just completely drawn to the loss. Finally having fighters deceased on the battlefield, because that's what I would have expected to see in a real life situation. But it just brings it out very nicely in the presentation. Even the comfort of illustrating becomes the reality. Okay, they will become more comfortable with this. I'm not sure what the reason was for subtracting the illustration of the Union dead versus the Confederate dead. But here you've got the integration finally in the end.
Well, so there's a couple points that you raised. Let me try to bring this in. Okay, so I'll go back to the first question. So if union audiences, United States audiences are opening up their Frank Leslie's or their Harper's Weekly, and they have a son or a husband out at the front, what does that paper want to convey? The paper wants to convey the numbers of Confederate dead, that this was a victorious battle, that this cause, Lincoln's not very popular in '62, emancipation is preliminary, is days later. I think there's a political dimension to capturing images of the Confederate dead. Alexander Gardner bears all that out in his 1866 sketchbook, in which he has commentary about these images and often censures Southern citizens for not immediately or properly burying their own kin. As the war progresses, there's a series of very jarring images taken outside of Petersburg of very young men, very close up, very bloodied faces photographed showing the Confederacy's done. They're literally using 18-year-old boys at the front as good propaganda. James Hope, our artist, not only has the distance from the war in which he himself, although he wasn't the person who healed from the conflict, he had a terrible physical and possibly psychological trauma from Antietam. But Hope, in particular, I think wanted to demonstrate the terrors of that day. Antietam is his last battle. He sustains ear trauma from the artillery. Antietam's often called artillery hell. And he wants to capture, several decades later, the terrors of that battlefield, and this image in particular transmits that. I would say, too, a quick note, this is an image that's transformed into a very popular lithograph that is sold by the hundred. So this isn't just an idiosyncratic painting that actually was at a barn in Watkins Glen until the 1970s. Hope had a gallery that was destroyed in the 1920s by floods. This particular image also became a popular engraving. And I think it's trying to transmit a counter image to the prevailing culture that still was there. Currier and Ives, Allison and Kurtz, they're very celebratory views of war. So just a little bit of context for some of those images that may help flesh out your comments.
One other quick note is that by the time a lot of photographers got to the battlefields, a lot of the federal dead had been buried because
Yes.
they had occupied the fields. So,
It was just a technical,
yeah.
yeah.
So the Confederate dead are still, because the federal burial parties buried Union troops first.
Yeah.
And they held the field.
And these are possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are probably Union troops. And at Gettysburg, it's the same thing. But at Gettysburg, there's a couple of graphic pictures of Union dead that were taken. And they're still arguing about where those photographs were taken, but they're unquestionably Union soldiers. So there were some taken. And then you got a question, sir.
I have several, but I don't want to take too many other people's stuff. And thank you for this. It's
Huh?
terrific. I'm an IT guy, so I'm going to ask about technology. What kind of photography was this? They're out in the field. You always see pictures of them with their heads in and covered, and they take them, and then they got these big glass pieces. And do they develop them in the field? They don't have Polaroids. So how does that happen?
They're all developed on the field. You only have like 10 minutes from the time you set up. Like, these are wet glass.
So are the chemicals within it?
So they had portable darkrooms. There's some bright photos of Gardner's portable darkroom at Antietam. So they, prepared these glass plates. And remember, this is a dual lens camera because we're shooting stereo photographs.
Gibson's using the dual lens camera.
So they were all using those just so they could do that? They weren't
You're seeing them.
Almost all the pictures taken in Antietam were done stereoscopically, dual lens cameras.
So were they planning on selling these when they went, or did they do it to actually?
Well, they're working for Brady to
Yeah, they worked for Brady. And the other thing was, after you took the photo, you only had a couple minutes to fix
Right.
the chemical. So to me, the fact that they're able to get off nearly 80 shots in a couple days is unbelievable.
Yeah.
I think
When they're taken originally, they're on glass plates.
Right. That's what
And then they're trying to toss the paper.
Yeah, and that the paper is the most the most affordable, cheapest form, and then again, oftentimes you would see affixed to the back of those baseboard the advertisement for Brady's album gallery. Do you have the camera museum?
No, I don't.
People today do it both artistically and in sort of a living history capacity.
Right.
It's still an incredible way to take a photograph. The resolution is just, it's so compelling.
And it's almost something.
It's temperamental.
It's temperamental, and you have to practice it, almost develop a gut feel. Because when they remove that lens cap, they're physically removing.
All right.
And depending on how bright or overcast it is, will depend on how long they take that lens cap off. So sometimes it's literally off, on, and then sometimes it's off for a couple beats. But it's only through practice that the greats like Gardner get those exposures just right. And then even after that lens is exposed, you have to expose it in another chemical bath and do that at just the right amount of time, or it'll become overexposed or underexposed. There's a lot of steps to create these things.
And you'll see if you go through the Library of Congress a lot, cracked glasses, there's all sorts of things that can happen.
Right.
And then if you put it to the sun, over time, it fades out the image, it disappears.
But some of these photographs in person, they're unbelievably crisp.
Shall we look at that one, Dana? This is
Yeah.
beautiful.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay, you got the other thing.
Oh, okay. Could I ask an actual
Yeah.
type of thing?
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, yeah.
you had mentioned about people,
I don't think, just so people understand what's going on, we're going to show some of these in stereo view and give you 3D glasses if you want to stay here and see that. But go ahead.
okay, so people going on the battlefield, seeing in Patton was terrific, in which after a battle in northern Africa, you would see people from villages and all going out there, not for souvenirs, but they were poor. They were stealing booze, they were stealing clothes. Did any of that happen?
Yeah, so the question is, were people stealing items from the battlefield because they themselves may have been economically under-resourced? Absolutely. So after Antietam and after Gettysburg, the United States military has to dispatch crews to go out and start collecting firearms that have been taken by the thousands, blankets, boots, clothing items, you name it. So yes, I had another talk that I did up at Gettysburg on that sort of topic, and that was one of the subparts is lots of people were taking things out of necessity, but it's government property.
Right.
And so the government's trying to sort of like take it back essentially. So yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Did Albert Holmes find his son?
I'm sorry?
Albert Holmes went,
Oh, yeah.
did he find his son?
Yeah, so the question is, did Oliver Wendell Holmes find his son? So Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. writes another piece called My Hunt for the Captain that is his journey. And it really portrays, I think, the frenetic nature of a Civil War battlefield's aftermath. So Holmes is moved from field hospital to field hospital. He ends up in Keedysville. He thinks at one point he's in Hagerstown. It takes some time. Holmes is actively searching for days, but he eventually does reconnect. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., and we'll sort of conclude on this note, of course, becomes the famous jurist, and throughout his life, Antietam remains very much connected to his memories. He saves 2 bloodied uniforms from his Civil War service that he keeps in his closet for 50 years, and then he dies in the early 20th century, but lives this remarkable life. So yes, the father does find the son after a long, arduous journey. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to my esteemed colleague here.
Thank you. That was a great presentation.
Just a quick introduction. This is Bob Kozak, and Bob has worked with the museum to put on a display of Alexander Gardner's Antietam photographs as they would have been shown in his gallery. We've done that a couple times. The exhibit is down now. We hope to bring it up later in the next year or so at our Barton location in DC. But what Bob is going to show you are the Gardner photos, and then you can see them in the stereo view sense that Jim has talked about in his talk.
Thanks. Just want to give you a couple details on this. These are taken from the original negatives at the Library of Congress and put in a little thing here for the Library of Congress. They have like over the past 10 years, more than that now, they've made high definition versions of these photos available to the public. So you just go on lc.gov, enter Civil War, and very high def. Now the reason they're so high definition is because they're glass negatives, and you've heard about grain, back in the days when we had 35 millimeter film, and it was grainy and you could only get down to a certain level of detail. Well, glass negatives have virtually no level of detail. It's like an infinite number of pixels on a glass negative. So you'll see these, you'll probably go, well, how could they photograph that well? Well, they actually did. And that's all.
You want the lights off?
Yeah.
Is that working for everybody?
I got it.
Yeah, perfect. Good, yeah, of course. Yeah, take care.
Those are actually, I believe those are Union troops.